Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of The American Founding. I'm your host, Dr. Jay Koss. It's sponsored by the Grove City College Institute for Faith and Freedom. And before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about Grove City College. It's a place that's worth knowing about. It is among the best colleges and universities. It's located here where I am in Western Pennsylvania, but it has a nationwide reputation because it fosters intellectual, moral, and social development consistent with a commitment to Christian faith. It advocates individual freedom and personal responsibility and seeks to preserve America's political, economic, and religious heritage. And Grove City College is one of the few truly independent colleges in the nation because it accepts no federal funding. Maybe you heard in the news yesterday and today that the Trump administration is seeking to remove Harvard University's federal funding because it's not following various rules. Well, if you don't accept federal funding, you can follow your own light. And that's exactly what Grove City's done. They were one of the first to do that. They took a case all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was a real David versus Goliath sort of moment. And so the college, nevertheless, is able to operate free of governmental interference or political influence. And I encourage you to learn more at faithandfreedom.com. Okay, so I am calling this week's episode, and thank you for being here this week. Last week, we took off because of the Institute for Faith and Freedom's conference the week before. We took off because my whole family had been sick for like 3 weeks straight, and frankly, I didn't have the energy to do another. I didn't have the energy to write the podcast. So, but I'm calling this week's episode The Essential United States Senate. And I hope by the end of this episode, you'll get a sense of why the Senate is so important to our constitutional system. Not just that we could not have had a constitution without the Senate, but also from a broader perspective that the Senate remains so important to the maintenance of the constitutional order. So bear that in mind, and also bear in mind, because we've talked a lot about James Madison, I think a lot of you probably know I'm a big James Madison fan. Madison was very unhappy with the Senate. This is not what he wanted. So when we're talking about the Senate as it actually is created, we're talking about something that Madison did not want. Okay, so bear that in mind. 2 weeks ago, the last episode, I called Getting the Lay of the Land at the Constitutional Convention. Who's there? Who are the players? So on and so forth. One thing that I don't think I mentioned, maybe I did, but I certainly didn't emphasize it, is that voting at the convention happens by state. Every state gets one vote. That ends up being of crucial importance in the shape that the Constitution is going to take. And it is a good lesson, just as a general political lesson, about how the outcome is often dictated by the rules. If, for instance, on the other hand, every state had votes according to how many people they had, if the votes were weighted that way, we would have had a very different Constitution. And this is going to be hugely significant in the fight over the Senate, because the small states at the Constitutional Convention are punching way above their weight in terms of their population. So that leads us to this week's episode, the fight over the Senate, or specifically the fight over equal proportion in the Senate, this idea that every state gets an equal number of senators. It's a huge fight. It's probably the biggest fight at the entire convention. The only possible exception is a fight over slavery, but even that wasn't as ugly as this. Now, before we get to the fight and what they fought about, it's important that we spend some time thinking about what they didn't fight about. There's a lot of consensus at the Constitutional Convention. I think that you could say that there's a general agreement on a framework of how the government should look. It's a very nationalist government. They all basically agree to it. Disagreements also, for the most part, get resolved amicably. The institutional role of the Senate is actually a really good example of this. They fought tooth and nail over how to apportion power in the Senate, but the role of the Senate in the Constitution was widely agreed to. And one of the ways the framers thought a republic could work was through the process of refinement. This Madison in Federalist 10 uses the phrase refine and enlarge the public view. So that's what representation does. It refines and enlarges the public views. And you see this a lot in our system even today, but especially when the Constitution was originally created. It's the idea that the common people, average citizens, are going to be good judges of their everyday experiences. But they're going to struggle with more abstract, for them, questions, where matters like foreign affairs or interstate commerce, for instance, they're going to have a good read on how their own lives are affected by these laws. But as you shift the focus to a more and more national perspective, people are kind of going to lose the forest for their own trees. And so this is where the idea of refinement comes in, because what the framers thought was that for these more complicated questions that involve, say, foreign policy, you need men of character, wisdom, and virtue, special patriotism to handle these. They didn't think that average citizens were capable of doing this, but they thought that average people could identify individuals such as that. So they, in this case, with the Senate, people would vote for their state legislatures, and then their state legislatures would vote for the senators, and a similar role with the presidency. The idea here is that people are going to struggle to identify the men who have the expertise to handle foreign affairs, which is something the Senate's going to have to handle. But they can identify people in their own community who are wise and virtuous and just. They'll elect them to the state legislatures. State legislatures will choose senators. That was their working theory. Does it work in practice all the time? Absolutely not. But it is an operating theory that they had. Now, this idea of refinement is going to get an enormous amount of pushback during the ratification debates. And the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, really hone in on their disdain for they hate the whole Senate, top to bottom, soup to nuts. They hate the whole thing. And the Senate to them illustrated an elitism, which you can still see in our system of government today when you compare our system of government to the state governments. If you think, for instance, I live in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have judicial elections. We don't have judicial elections for federal judges. We elect the treasurer, we elect the attorney general. We don't have those on the federal level. The president appoints them. We have voting on constitutional amendments in Pennsylvania. You don't get that on a federal level. Not in Pennsylvania, but in other states, you get ballot initiatives and recall. The federal system has none of that. Right? And the argument that the framers are going to sort of lean on is that as long as all power is derived eventually, or maybe better put, ultimately from the people, it's still a republic. So you can have direct reliance on the people or indirect. So the people have a direct choice in the House of Representatives, and they have an indirect choice in the Senate. So the idea here, the basic thinking is that the Senate is going to be ultimately a Republican institution, even though it's not a Democratic institution. We're going to talk more about that later. Right? And the purpose of the Senate is to facilitate a natural aristocracy. I mean, they're not even hiding their agenda here. By calling it the Senate, they're basically calling back to the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate of the Republic was the place where the elites who had already gone through what the Romans called the cursus honorum, the sort of like career path of political and public offices. And they get term limited out. The highest office that a Roman citizen could get was the consulship. And that's term limited to a year. So you would have a lot of ex-politicians and a lot of ex-leaders, people who are no longer eligible for these offices. They would go to the Senate. And the idea would be is that the Senate would sort of reflect a natural aristocracy. Right? And again, this is going to be a huge problem for the anti-federalists. And not simply because of its aristocratic nature, but when you think about the Senate in the constitutional system, it is the nexus of political power in the government. It has it has legislative power because it passes laws with the House. It has indirect judicial power because of its oversight of the courts. It also convicts impeached officials, so that's a form of judicial power. It also has a kind of executive power as well, in the sense that it approves cabinet officials. And it also signs off on treaties, so it has oversight over the president. And on top of all of that, the Senate is the place, or it originally was the place, where the federal government and the state governments interfaced, because the state governments were the ones that chose senators. So if you were going to draw an elaborate diagram of the constitutional system as the framers designed, the Senate has to be at the center. It's just where it is. None of that, though, what I've discussed so far is not really a problem at the convention. I mean, there are disagreements on things like this, but the ultimate scope of disagreement on the Senate is not on its role in the system, but it's on the question of apportionment. In other words, how many senators does each state get? Now, 2 episodes ago, we talked about Madison's Virginia plan, and Madison wanted to create a national republic where all branches of the government were dependent upon the entire political community of the United States. So for Madison, that meant that the House had to be apportioned by population, but so did the Senate. So just as Virginia would get more House members than Delaware, it would also get more senators. And in fact, this is another important point. Delaware, in this scheme, would probably get no senators, because you want a sort of an aristocratic, elitist body. It has to have fewer members than the House to encourage a kind of refined way of thinking. So in that scenario, Virginia's going to have senators and Delaware's probably not going to have any. Now, we learned in history class in high school and in civics, we learned the story of how this gets resolved. Through the Connecticut Compromise, Roger Sherman, Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut proposed this idea of splitting the plan, where the House is proportional and the Senate is equal. And that's all absolutely true, and it's a brilliant political compromise. But what I want to do tonight is I wanted to dig into the nature of this debate a little bit deeper, and so that we can appreciate the Senate as it comes down to us is a compromise, as we learned in high school civics. But it's also a compromise that I think reflects at the time and continues to reflect today a deeper reality within our nation. And that the argument I want to suggest to you is that a national republic, an extended republic, a large republic like the United States of America requires something like the Senate. Because it's not just enough in a republic that everybody gets a vote. That's not enough, right? That's enough for a democracy where the people rule. But a republic is something different. A republic is a democracy that prevents the majority from ruling in a way that violates principles of justice and the general welfare. And that is a system where it's not just that people get to vote, it's that their viewpoint, their perspectives, their values are meaningfully considered in the policymaking process. They actually have more than a vote, they have a voice. That's an important aspect of republicanism. And I would argue that in a continent-spanning republic, that sort of consideration has to be given to matters of geography. And I'm going to talk a lot about that as we go through here. So I would argue that in a lot of respects, the compromise on the Senate was the essential compromise. You don't have a constitution or a country without this compromise. And I would argue as well that the Senate is still essential to the survival of the union of the states. How do these 50 disparate, geographically, cultural, economically disparate entities stay together, hang together? I think the Senate. Now, to be clear, the Virginia plan is a deal breaker for a lot of states on the matter of the Senate. As a matter of fact, Delaware instructs its delegates when the delegates are sort of like chosen by the Delaware legislature, and they're given instructions and they're given credentials. One of their instructions is you have to keep equality of representation in Congress. You have to keep it. And I mentioned this as well, that the Delaware delegates, several of them are formidable. John Dickinson, who's a delegate from Delaware, is a really big deal. And he is not somebody to be trifled with, and he is very serious about his view on representation in the House. So this is what he says. Now, bear in mind here, I want to give you a quote from Dickinson. This is from June 7th, 1787. So bear in mind that for all intents and purposes, the convention meaningfully begins its work, I want to say like May 29th, May 28th. I don't remember the exact date. One of those 2 days is when Randolph submits the Virginia plan. So this is June 7th. This is a week and a half into the actual work of the convention, and they're voting on, the Senate. This is what Dickinson says. He says the preservation of the states in a certain degree of agency is indispensable. It will produce that collision between the different authorities which should be wished for in order to check each other. To attempt to abolish the states altogether would degrade the councils of our country, would be impracticable, would be ruinous. That is a very, very serious comment to make that early. That is, in Dickinson's own very gentlemanly way, a shot across the bow of Madison's Virginia plan. That this is not going to work for us. We are not doing this. All right, I'll give you another quote here. This is a couple days later. This is a week later. He says, on June 14th, John Dickinson says, some of the members from the small states wish for 2 branches in the general legislature and are friends to a good national government. But we would sooner submit to a foreign power than submit to be deprived of an equality of suffrage in both branches of the legislature and thereby be thrown under the domination of the large states. Yikes. That is a very vehement statement. And I think I mentioned in the last episode that you can tell how serious the states are about the present situation based on who they sent to the convention. John Dickinson is one of those people that really doesn't get remembered in your traditional histories that, maybe you learned in high school, but he's a big deal. John Dickinson is a big deal. He was an early opponent of the Townshend duties, so this is going all the way back to 1768. He actually gave, when Madison goes up to Princeton, he goes up early to see the previous class graduate at Princeton, and Dickinson gave the commencement address. So Dickinson is already kind of a regional hero, but when Madison is just a college kid. And he had been a member of the Second Continental Congress. He had wanted to avoid independence, and he disagreed with independence, so he resigned his seat so that the vote on independence could be unanimous. So you'd think, well, that's the end of his political career, but it wasn't. He comes back. He is, after the decision for independence has been made, he is a stalwart defender of American freedom, and he is despite voting or opposing independence in 1776, he's back, and had not just been effectively the governor of Delaware, he had also been the governor of Pennsylvania. So this is a big statement from a big guy, right? So what's going on here? Like I said, we need to think about geography, and I'm going to get to that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the math, because politics is often about math. So let's talk about the math of the convention. I mentioned already, everybody gets 1 vote. Every state, I mean. There are 11 states at the Constitutional Convention when this matter is being debated. That's important. New Hampshire is not there, and Rhode Island is not there. Rhode Island never shows up. New Hampshire shows up late after this dispute has been resolved. As a matter of fact, at some point, somebody suggests from one of the small states, having a notice or something sent to New Hampshire to remind them to come, as in we need their vote, and it gets voted down. So the preliminary vote on the idea of a proportional Senate, which is what Madison wanted, was a narrow victory for Madison. The final result is Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia are yes. Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York are no. Now, there's a couple things going on here. Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina are large states. Georgia is large in terms of its geography. It is small in terms of its population, but Georgia is looking to a future where it's going to be large. South Carolina is voting with the Southerners. All right. Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York are no's. Now, New York is a large state, and New York also has room to grow. But it's a special case because the governor of New York, George Clinton, doesn't want a strong constitution. He wants to retain as much as the old Confederation as possible. So even though Hamilton's in that delegation, he gets outvoted. Now, it is not simply that these small states are small. It is also that they don't really have anywhere to go. They don't have room to grow. Connecticut does not have Western territory to fill into in any meaningful way. Same with Maryland, definitely same with Delaware, and New Jersey has a lot of space, but not nearly as much as the big states. So this is not simply a matter of these states being small. It is a matter of these states being small indefinitely. And indeed, if you look at these states, I mean, New Jersey has certainly grown in population, but Delaware is still one of the smallest states in the Union in terms of population. So is Connecticut, frankly. All right. Now, the large states win 6-5, but this is a preliminary vote. And what they end up voting for in these first couple of weeks is something that's not very practical. And it actually sort of demonstrates how weak Madison's position is when you start digging into it a little bit, like you dig under the surface. And Madison, in his notes, saw this as well. And the reason has to do with the Virginia Plan specifics. The Virginia Plan called for the state governments to nominate candidates for the Senate, and then the House would pick from this pool of candidates. Right, but very early on, that gets voted down. And instead of having the state governments nominate candidates to be chosen by the House, the delegates change it to the state governments are just going to pick the senators. Now that is bad news for Madison, because when you think through the implication of this, if the state governments are going to be picking senators, then every state gets at least one senator if the Senate is going to be proportional, right? Everybody's got to get one if they're picking. But that is going to lead to a big Senate. It would be the same size for all intents and purposes as the House. If it's going to be proportional and every state gets to pick at least one, then the Senate's going to be basically the same size as the House. And the whole point of the Senate is to refine and enlarge the dictates of the House. And to do that, you want to narrow a more elite group of people. All right, so all of this goes to show that even though Madison wins the initial vote, they're still working through things. Everything's preliminary. And what you get then as a consequence is a narrow victory for the big state delegates, but that doesn't actually make any sense. And as the Dickinson quotations I mentioned earlier illustrate, what exists here is a vehement minority, right? It is not simply that Delaware or Connecticut or New Jersey or Maryland is opposed to this. It is that this is a deal breaker for them. And they didn't have the votes, but as the old saying goes, in politics, when you have the vote, you vote. When you don't have the votes, you talk. And that's what those small states do. They start talking, and they start insisting on revisiting. And on June 15th, this is sort of after a solid 10, 12 days of victories for the Nationalists in the Virginia Plan. But on June 15th, William Patterson, who's a delegate from New Jersey, I believe he was the Attorney General of New Jersey, so another illustration of somebody who was not nationally known, but was a big deal in his state. He introduces an alternative plan of government, which gets called the New Jersey Plan, with a unicameral Congress and equally portions. It is not a practical plan. And Madison effectively debates it into the ground a couple days after it's introduced. But this does have the effect of resetting the momentum, and then you get down into the real nitty-gritty of this debate over the Senate, which lasts a couple of weeks. And the delegates are circling around what is really kind of a fundamental question that speaks to the heart of what the Senate is. And that question is, do the states represent distinct factions or interests in political society? That's important. Everybody at the convention agrees that a republic has to protect the rights of factions, interests, communities. It has to reconcile the views of individual groups into public policy that works for the whole community, right? In other words, everybody agrees that a republic has to guard against democratic tyranny or majoritarian tyranny. That's the key difference between democracy and a republic. A republic uses the principle of democracy or the rule of the majority, but it tries to rechannel that democratic energy to make sure that the majority doesn't violate the rights of the minority. And so the question really is, do the states actually represent interests? And so would small states then therefore be in a minority? Now, Madison has an opinion on this. This is not an issue that he's blind to. His plan of government, in fact, is designed purposefully to deal with the problem of majority factionalism. He thinks that a large extended republic is going to accomplish that, right? That's his whole idea. You throw all these different factions into a national big government, force them to fight it out. And when the small states say, hey, what about us? He dismisses that. He does not think that states constitute a distinct interest. He thinks that states reflect interests, but that some states will reflect an interest that'll be shared in other states. And as a matter of fact, Madison at one point argues that the number one interest that cuts across the country is not large state, small state, but slavery. And you can see this in the large state, small state dispute, right? Virginia's a large state, has slavery. Maryland, small state, has slavery. Delaware, small, slavery, right? Pennsylvania, large state, doesn't have slavery. New Jersey, I'm pretty sure New Jersey either didn't have slavery at that point or was on its way to abolishing it, right? So that's Madison's point. Madison's point is, look, slavery is the example. That's an example of an issue that we need to make sure that the country, we balance the interests of everybody. But we don't need the states as political entities in that. Right? Hamilton makes a similar point. Hamilton's argument is, and Madison's point's very prophetic, and so is Hamilton's. Hamilton argues that the divide is really between the commercial states and the the commercial interests and the agricultural interests. And there are some small states that are agricultural, like New Hampshire, and then there are some large states that are commercial, like New York, right? So this is also very prophetic. But the small states are insistent. Basically, their argument boils down to, if you don't give us rights, our interests are going to be obliterated. We are going to be swallowed up by Pennsylvania. That would be Delaware's argument. We're going to be swallowed up by Pennsylvania. Maryland is going to be swallowed up by Virginia. And that argument implies, oh, well, they have a distinct interest, right? And they go back and forth on this and back and forth for weeks. And it eventually devolves into threats. I mean, the delegates from the large states, I mean, you read Madison's notes and it's pretty clear they're trying to bully the delegates from the small states, which actually kind of proves the point of the small states. Basically, what they're saying is, this is the best deal you're going to get. If this convention collapses because you small state delegates are being too stubborn and the union falls apart, the big states are going to bully you more and more. And maybe the low point of the convention comes actually on June 30th, 1787, when Gunning Bedford of Delaware responds to this threat. So this is a threat that they're making, and Gunning Bedford of Delaware says, the small ones, the small states, will find some foreign ally of more honor and good faith who will take them by the hand and do them justice. Now that is a big yikes, pressure drop moment. All right, this idea that the small states are just going to find allies, as in like European allies, as in we're going to let Europe come back into North America. But it's an indication, again, that the small states do think they have direct and distinct interests. And eventually, Benjamin Franklin makes a suggestion. And Franklin, he plays an interesting role at the convention. He doesn't really, he's really interested in compromise and facilitating common ground. He doesn't really offer a lot of practical ideas, and even this idea that I'm going to give you is not practical, but it is. I think it was probably something that had to be said. This is what Franklin said. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers employing the insistence of heaven and its blessings on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. Again, yikes. I mean, the implication here basically is like reason's not going to get us to the solution. We have to pray for divine intervention. Now, they vote this down. One of the reasons I believe they voted it down is because they didn't have the money to pay for somebody to come in every day. And another one, a very typical American in the 18th century, is they all had different religious beliefs, so they couldn't agree on anybody. Very America in 1787. But it demonstrates a kind of proof that there is no resolving this tension. There's no solution. This isn't a problem that admits of a solution in the traditional sense of like, oh, you're right, you've convinced me. There's no convincing anybody here. And it's not just because it's not that it's a metaphysical question, right? Like, do states have distinct interests? I mean, that's sort of a metaphysical question. But it's that it's entangled with the politics of the time, right? This is one of the problems. And the way to think about this is that in many respects, the great thing about the Constitutional Convention was that these guys sort of, by going to the convention, they sort of step out of time to ponder questions like executive power. And the sense in which I mean they're stepping out of time is that they're debating this without knowing how these decisions are going to affect their immediate interests. Like the immediate political implications of, say, a 2/3 majority to override a veto is not evident. It's one of the things that makes the convention so interesting to study, is because these guys are not building an instrument of government to win the next election. They're not trying to change the rules for this particular political thing, because nobody knew what was going to happen with these things. However, with the Senate, everybody knows what the implication of this is going to be, right? If you have a proportional Senate, then the large states are going to hold most of the political power. And to get back to my previous point here, one thing was math. The math is 6-5. And the other point is geography. And I think one of the things that ultimately forges the compromise that they forge is because of geography. So we've got to think a little bit about geography, right? Issues fell on a 6-5 basis or something like that several times over otherwise close votes. And they just, okay, well, maybe they went revisited, but maybe not this. And not this one, right? The losing side stares down the winning side, at least from the preliminary vote. And I think one of the reasons that they could do that, the 5 states could get just a handful of defections from the 6 states that initially supported Madison, is that you can't have a country without those 5 states, right? If you go back and think about the geography of this, let me go back and just remind you, the large states are, and north to south, Massachusetts, then Pennsylvania, then Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, okay? The small states, north to south, would be Connecticut. New York is kind of a weird case, but New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, okay? If Delaware and the rest of those states are being serious and their bottom line is we're not agreeing to this, right? And the 6 states say, okay, fine, well, I guess you're out. The whole thing's done. Right? You don't have a country. Think about where those small states fit on the map. You would have Massachusetts on its own, and then you would have Pennsylvania on its own. Yeah, sure, okay, Virginia and Pennsylvania are contiguous at this point, but nobody's living that far out west, really, for all intents and purposes, in 1787. This is like where I live is right now is just wilderness. Right? Pennsylvania is effectively surrounded by states that don't want this compromise. And then the South wants this compromise, right? But that's 3 countries. That's not one country, right? That's 3 countries. And that's why geography matters. And geography simply matters in a large country. That's why the small states resisted, and it's why ultimately enough of the delegates from the large states relented. And so they don't resolve the tension, right? They split the difference. And by the way, Madison is angry about this. He is unhappy with this compromise. And when they form a committee to hammer out the compromise, he is not included on the committee, right? He's the compromise. He doesn't like the Connecticut compromise where the House is going to reflect a national republic and the Senate reflects a federal republic like the old system, right? And one of the things that I would emphasize here is that the House and the Senate, like they don't really make a lot of sense. The House is a national institution. The Senate is a confederal institution. So what are we? Are we confederation or are we a republic or a national republic? We're just kind of both, right? Like that tension that exists, the tension that existed in 1787, it still exists today. This is why you still see people complaining about the Senate. Why? That's not fair that Wyoming gets as many Senate seats as California. I mean, yeah, because the Senate gives a privilege to place, and I actually think that that's a good thing. Sometimes when in this podcast, I don't like to editorialize too much. I mean, obviously, I sort of have my preferences about particular things, and I'll mention them. But I want to be really unequivocal here. Like 3 cheers for equal proportionment in the Senate, because if you want to have a republic that goes from one ocean to another, but where population is unevenly distributed, then you have to account for place. And that's what the Senate does. And I would argue that it's the Senate is the reason there is a dog that never barked, and that dog was the West. Right? When we think about, like, what's the great sectional crisis? Well, we all know the great sectional crisis was the fight between the North and the South in the Civil War. But I would reckon that if you went back to, say, 1787, and you told people in the future there's going to be a great sectional crisis, I think a lot of them would anticipate the West losing loyalty to the Union. Indeed, I think we talked about that a couple of weeks ago with George Washington. George Washington, one of the reasons why he wants to improve the Potomac River Basin and improve transportation networks in the Potomac River Basin is he wants to make sure that the Western interest is drawn eastward. Right? And indeed, at the convention, they're aware that there is going to be a Western faction that is going to be distinct. The West does not yet exist, but it is going to exist. And the West, though, it is seamless. It is seamless, the extent to which the West integrates into the Union. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, obviously, transportation improvements, the railroads, things like that, telegraph, economic development. But I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind, and when we're thinking about the West, all of these far-flung places that don't have a lot of people, they want to become states. Why would they want that? Why wouldn't they want to be, like, free? Well, one reason is that the Senate is a fantastic deal for Western states. You join the Union, you get all the benefits of military protection, and you get a meaningful chunk of political power. You don't get enough to form a majority, right, small states, but you get 2 senators and 1 House member and 3 electoral votes, which means that you have enough political power that your opinions have to be reckoned with. And so the Westerners, as they're moving out there, only infrequently feel an urge to start their own operation. Instead, usually you see the opposite, like almost always. They want to get into the Union as quick as they can. And this is an important part of Republican politics. Again, it's not, I mentioned this earlier at the top of the program, it's not enough that everybody votes. It's that everybody gets a meaningful say in policy formation. Now, do we do that perfectly in our system? No, we don't. And I'm not saying that the Senate covers all of this. And I would actually argue that in 1787, I'd say Madison and Hamilton were onto something. That there weren't a lot of meaningful political differences between the large states and the small states. But moving into the future, as there becomes a distinct Western interest, and then moving further into the future where there's urbanization, and so you get a distinct rural interest, the Senate protects those interests. Now, again, to be clear, does that mean the Senate protects every minority interest? No, It doesn't. But what it does do is it creates a kind of glue to hold the union together. Because, of course, what you need to hold a country as large as this together is, if you can imagine a scenario in which all political power in the United States at some point in the future just gets concentrated on the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. And the people who are living in the middle of the country are a minority. They're going to lose every vote. Every vote, unless their interests align with the population centers on the coast. Are they going to stay in the Union forever if that were to happen? Like, if we were to abolish the Senate, would North Dakota, would South Dakota stay in the Union forever? I mean, I'm sure for a while they would, certainly. Loyalty, patriotism, things like that. But, one of the reasons that patriotism is a byproduct of a shared belief that the system is basically fair. And if people living in the middle of the country become convinced over generations that the system is basically unfair, are they going to stay? Not necessarily. And so I would argue that the Senate is really a kind of a geographical glue, which we really need for a country as big as our country. So that's sort of my argument for why the Senate is essential. Okay, so that's all I have for us this week. Next week, we're going to talk about the slavery issue, which is another issue that is extremely divisive. It's a really interesting issue. And I think usually when I talk to people about slavery at the Constitutional Convention, a lot of times a question I frequently hear is, well, why didn't they just do something about slavery? So we're going to talk about that next week as we continue to look at the Constitutional Convention. And so just as a final point, if you haven't already, I'd ask you to consider subscribing to the podcast through your favorite streamer, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. We're on other ones too. And if you have occasion and you wouldn't mind, take a few moments to review and comment on the podcast. 5 stars are always appreciated, but it provides me with useful feedback and it helps boost the signal of the podcast and helps others who are interested in this finding us. So yeah, I'd appreciate that. And I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and we shall see you next week.